Hello, everyone. Let's talk about this new news in regards to Hedera and the institutional side of things. Do they really have some new key connectors to get the job done before we can have some institutional mass adoption? And how about this for size? When we talk about the quote unquote flip of the switch, is Hedera really part of that mix, or is it really just going to be Ripple XRP, Stellar, Quant, and some of these other ones? For me personally, I think the answer is yes, Hedera is part of that mix because of ISO 222. But when we talk about tokenized bonds, will Hedera be the one that is the real shining star that doesn't get talked about enough? For me, I think the answer is yes. Stick around to the end of the outline. You're going to want to hear more about some of my findings and why I'm so bullish and happy that I hold the HBAR coin. As we move forward, smash that like if you haven't done so already. Try to share the program with other people that may not understand the bigger picture. Let's jump right into it. So, look at this for a second. This is, I think, crucial for your understanding. A lot of times things get mentioned, and I know that I'm not the only person who's covering some of this, but for me, I wanted to get more into the bigger picture. So, there was an announcement, of course, it was yesterday, and it's in regards to this thing called Copper. Now, Copper HQ, just in case you weren't aware of it, is part of custody, prime services, and collateral management for, of course, digital assets. They are opening the doors for institutional DeFi, of course, on the Hedera network. Now, when I got more into this, I saw this part, and it's about Dmitry Tokarev. He is a chief executive officer over at Hedera, and he considers this integration highly valuable for both fintech firms and the crypto community. Well, that affects us too, does it not? Yes, it does. He states that, basically speaking, that there's going to be full development stacks, and they're going to show that Hedera has a strong commitment to offering reliable custody solutions for institutional investors in the crypto space. This is great timing, in my opinion. Why is that? Well, making statements about Hedera being a one-stop shop and basically being a prime spot for DeFi, but for institutional DeFi, is great timing. And more importantly, but how so? Well, it's this statement. A while back, there was a misinterpreted article that was posted back in April 23, right, of this year. And it was stating that Hedera shared, for example, some institutional infrastructure with Archax and Onera in regards to tokenizing of BlackRock's ICS U.S. Treasury fund on its network. And of course, some people stated that, this was debunked and that BlackRock spokesperson offered, or confirmed, I should say, through Cointelegraph that it had no commercial relationship with Hedera, nor has BlackRock selected Hedera to tokenize any BlackRock funds. It says, as we have in the past, BlackRock will communicate directly with the public on the evolution of our digital asset strategy. Okay, fair enough, true. But you want to know something? They also have stated, and it's not just BlackRock, that, there's NDAs and so on. When we talk about BlackRock in itself, how many times do you see people say that the world's largest asset custodian, but when you ask or you see Larry Fink being interviewed about it, he denies that. Again, think about it. Probably for tax purposes. You go on and admit all that, it just opens up Pandora's box. I want to jump back into a little bit more of why I feel all of this is important. So, this collaboration, Copper and HBAR, right? Hedera, definitely significant, but we want to see how so in regards to Hedera more than, Copper. So, it's additional confirmation of institutional adoption. By partnering with, of course, a leading crypto custodian like Copper, Hedera is signaling its intent to attract institutional investors. Again, attract institutional investors. Maybe they don't really have something going on in regards to BlackRock, but I think they do. So is this crucial for long-term growth and the stability of the platform? I think the answer is yes, because even though you might not hear it from the horse's mouth of BlackRock, you got to keep in mind it's in the future when we have tokenization of bonds, but more importantly through Hedera would BlackRock decide, hey, you know what, time to jump on board with that? For me, I think the answer is yes. But back to the whole thing of copper. So would this expand the ecosystem for Hedera? That's the bottom line. I think the answer is yes. But how so? Well, it's the integration of HBAR into the copper clear loop network. Definitely opens opportunities for HBAR to be used in various DeFi applications. Again, that's utility in motion. We are not at mass adoption. But when you talk about institutions, that's where the real big money is at for me. You know, we talk about retail all day, but that's where the smart money is. Well, copper in itself definitely has a trust layer, and they definitely have that security that we need, especially when it comes to that plug and connect for institutions. So, believe it or not, they have a great reputation from what I gathered, and it's basically focused on security. And if anything, it will bolster Hedera's credibility as a safe and reliable platform for, of course, handling digital assets. That's a win. Moving forward, let's take you over to another announcement that may have flown under the radar. And this one was posted on the 5th, but it is also on the topic of institutions. How so? Enter in this company, organization. And they are basically the IIF. Why do they matter? Well, they stand for Institute of International Finance. And this means that Hedera joins the likes of Circle, Coinbase, and even BlackRock and other leading institutions to collaboratively foster global financial stability and sustainable economic growth. I'm going to take you over to this site here in a bit, but I want to point out where they're located first. As you can see here on the right side of your screen, they are located at 1333 Highway Street Northwest, number 1010 East in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. Well, interesting. You know, at the end of the day, being able to have close access to Capitol Hill and, you know, our nation's leading, you know, congressional connections, right, through legislators is a big deal. So, why am I pointing this out? Well, I decided to jump more into the weeds, if you will, on why I think this is important. So, for one, it's who is birthed out of a reaction, I should say, like I mentioned before. I found this to be interesting because it's the history of the IIF. And hear me out for a bit. You know, I know some of you guys just want to see price action, stuff like that, but you got to understand is what's going on in the background. There is some unique history in regards to the IIF. So they emerged out of the reaction of what happened back in 1983 in regards to what? An international debt crisis. Yeah, that's interesting because they were created by 38 banks of leading industrialized countries back in 1983 during the Reagan administration. So when we talk about, for example, the concept of, you know, things that we're invested into. I mean, I don't just hold HBAR. I hold, you know, Ripple's XRP, Stellar's XLM, but I am really gung-ho ISO 222 related coins and tokens that are part of that mix. And when I see this statement of, like, you know, what emerged from these debt crises is, well, last I checked, the United States is part of a debt crisis. And the way I look at it is the emerging technologies that will come out of the storm, and some people feel as though that this is the worst storm we've ever been into, and I would say that's true because we're at roughly, what, 36 to 38 trillion in debt. So when you see that this organization emerged in the early 80s as a reaction to a debt crisis, understand that if they chose Hedera, I think that's worth noting, and I think that's worth pointing out, that other than just being the typical person that just reads an article. Hear me out. I'm going to full screen this. There's more to it than meets the eye, no pun intended, because it's understanding it's their advocacy, okay? So they advocate for regulatory and financial economic policies. That's big. When we talk about, you know, this mandate of ISO 222 November 2025 and who will emerge from that, I think the unsung shining stars could very well be your Hederas. So there's broad interest of its members and fostering of global financial stability through economic growth, but this was, again, something that probably should have got mentioned a little bit more. Do they have a little bit more focus on certain key things? Yes, they do. They understand that they want to put a lot of focus on finance, digital risk and regulation, and even the debt. And this part about the debt, I think, is really going to say a lot of things when it comes to Hedera. There's membership in regards to this. Their membership includes commercial investment banks and, again, asset managers. I mean, think about, for example, BlackRock, right? They're supposed to be the leaders of all this, right? So they also have focus on sovereign wealth funds. I mean, all this stuff kind of seems like an institutional ETF, if you will, right? Jumping into the next part of this that I thought was really interesting, to say the least, is my own notes. And that basically is this. We talked about the emergence of this particular organization from this debt crisis that happened back in the 80s. But for some of you guys that want to know more about this, back in 1982 to 1983, the international debt crisis was caused by a combination of economic policy errors and global economic shocks. The crisis in itself began in August of 1982 when Mexico announced it could no longer service its debt, which led to a series of sovereign defaults around the world. The crisis was exacerbated by numerous factors, but this all seems too familiar in my opinion. So for one, high interest rates. In the United States, the interest rates, at least back then, were raised to combat inflation. Why am I bringing this to you? And what does it have to do with HBAR? Does this sound familiar, you guys? Yes, it does. Because we're all paying attention to this. You know, we always see all these, you know, Jerome Powell and, you know, what's the Fed going to do? They're going to hike interest rates and so on. Again, I think history has definitely repeated itself. But for me, it's seeing who will emerge after things are completed. And if anything, if we could solve the debt crisis, is Hedera part of that mix? I think it is. I don't think it's just Ripple's XRP. And this is why I don't want to be maxing on just one of them. I just want to own quite a big, I should say big, but, you know, a decent sized bag in regards to all this. I like being diversified. So the ones that emerge to combat inflation and, you know, the countries involved with this to repay debt. Listen to this. We had a time frame from 1975 to 1982 where there was increased borrowing. Again, does this sound familiar? Latin American countries increased their debt to commercial banks by 20.4% annually, quadrupling their total debt to over $315 billion by 1983. The debt represented 50% of the region's GDP, gross domestic product. As a result, we saw higher energy prices. Do we not see that going on right now? Higher energy prices, at least back then, reduced incomes and slowed economic expansion in developed countries, which led to a decrease in imports from non-industrial countries. As a result, at least then, you saw a rising dollar. But after 1981, the dollar increased in value on exchange markets, making it more expensive to service dollar loans. Now, people are going to say, okay, apples and oranges on that part. Hear me out. What's going on right now is the dollar, of course, as we know, is losing its value, and BRICS nations are emerging as a response from that. And I also want to state that while we are all paying attention to what's going on to the petrodollar and so on, some people feel as though that the dollar will crash. I don't think it's going to go to zero, but it could very well lose a significant amount of its value. What do we see as a direct response to this? So where I'm going with this is this. Back then, in response to that crisis, the International Monetary Fund, which is called IMF, began requiring creditors to provide explicit financing assurances. Hear me out. The IMF also adopted an approval in principle procedure to address the issues that arose when Paris Club practices prevented them from providing debt relief. Think about that. As we know here in the United States, there were some things that happened that hindered debt relief. And as a result, our country had to bail out the banks. So we've been there, done that. And some people point out that we may very well get into another particular recession. right? And it's just a repeat. But by 1983, hear me out, 27 countries had rescheduled their debts or were in the process of doing so, owing a total of 239 billion. Huh, we're into trillions of dollars now. 16 of those countries back then, of course, were Latin America and, of course, included Mexico. All right, where are we really going into this whole thing? Well, enter in this. I'm going to take you over to this PDF. Why is this important? Because it talks about what they call a silent revolution. Right now, as we speak, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution. I have gone over and read a good portion of this. And it says right from IMF.org, which is the International Monetary Fund's website, about the IMF from 1979 to 1989, about the silent revolution. It says back then, at least in 1990, they had details in regards to background interviews in mid to April, I guess, 1989, and how some of this stuff was proposed that there was going to be a conventional program, think about this, built around a sharp fiscal adjustment to be announced at the beginning of May of 1990 in regards to having a fund for the willingness to publicly support a wage price freeze and monetary reform that would be announced, I guess, back in June of 1990. But that schedule proved to be too ambitious. Think about this for a second. And they had to come up with an alternative that emerged of negotiating the conventional and shock program simultaneously while keeping that latter a closely held secret. All right, where am I really going with this? Enter into November of what? 2025. We talk about a flip of the switch moment. To me, it seems as though this is a repeat of history. But more importantly, back then, they had shock programs. And yes, they weren't distributed ledger technologies or blockchain. But again, fast forward to where we're at now. Because, say what you want, that was Web 1 era. Enter into Web 3. Jumping to the next part is who emerged in regards to this. This is interesting. Because they talked about how even with countries like Argentina, Mexico, so on and so forth, it was the creditors and it was the ones that were part of the private sectors that took on debt. All right? So it states here that while there were other ones that were part of this mix, it was the ones that abandoned this particular fund and how they gave up on regaining access to international financial markets. Okay, what about new markets? It says the debt strategy might not have been a complete success, but a few of the indebted countries were prepared to turn their backs on it. They had a primary goal of the debt strategy, but it was what emerged in the second half of 1982 to reestablish normal financial relations between creditors and debtors on the grounds that both groups would benefit and that a systemic crisis would thereby be averted. Think about the crisis that we are in right now. Not just the United States, but many other countries. It says, as the above brief review of the case-by-case approach suggests, the fund strategy to promote this objective was to assist countries in adjusting policies to a sustainable stance and to encourage commercial creditors to continue to provide enough financing until the indebted countries could get their economies back to a sustainable path. The first half of that strategy involved little more than an intensification of the fund's traditional role, basically with member countries. The second half, in contrast, required a sharp break with the fund's traditional arm's-length relations to provide private creditors. By 1985, a major preoccupation of the fund was the search of a means of closing the strategy, of restoring normality so that temporary surge in reliance on the fund could be quickly ended. Yeah, think about that. action reaction. And what did we have after all this happened? We had, for example, things going in a different direction. I mean, by the end of, was it going into January of 2021, we end up having a surplus right here in the United States. So we don't have that surplus anymore. But again, action reaction. Where I'm going with is this other statement, and it's understanding that what emerged from here. Okay, so back to this whole thing of Mexico for a second. This is going to make sense. Hopefully you're listening. Mexico's chief debt negotiator back then, Angel Guerriera, probably not pronouncing that right, headed the official delegation. And several of the international monetary staff, including Claudio Loser and some of these other people, got this whole thing done, but it was the progress of what happened under this EFF arrangement. There were discussions of a range of complex issues as the treatment of officially guaranteed debts of the private sector. Listen to this. This gets good. In the end, the 15 creditor countries agreed to reschedule approximately $1.2 billion in officially guaranteed private sector debts over a 6-year period. The main effect of this non-Paris Club deal, however, was not so much to strengthen Mexico's reserves as to lengthen the maturity of official credits, since it largely enabled Mexico to repay its bridge loan, even to the Bank of International Settlements. They were always involved in all this from day one. So that happened in 1983, but it was the repaying of debts in the private sector. Okay? So again, it's understanding the bigger picture and again why it was so important. So I'm going to take you over to what I gathered in summary, because I mean you're not going to sit here for me reading 100 pages of this particular book. But here's the bottom line. How much revenue did the private sector debtors earn from Mexico to repay its bridge loan from the Bank of International Settlements back in 1983? That's big. Well, here's the thing. Enter into the mix something like Hedera's Hbar. Now, where I'm going with this is this. As we know, Hedera has, for example, Bank Social, and that is a credit union, right? If anything, it's like a DeFi credit union. Enter back into history, because in 1982, Mexico faced a severe debt crisis and, of course, defaulted on its international obligations. Does this not sound familiar? To stabilize its financial situation, Mexico in itself received a bridge loan from, of course, the BIS. I just mentioned that. But what's important is that basically during this period of time, while the exact revenues were not provided, you have to understand that basically speaking, Mexico was negotiating a debt restructuring with the international creditors, including, of course, private banks. All right, what about, for example, some of the credit unions? There was many factors that influenced Mexico's ability to, of course, repay the loans, but it included oil revenues, trade balances. Does this not sound familiar? And even financial assistance from international institutions. The government and private sector worked together to meet their repayment obligations, which include the restructuring of existing debt, refinancing, and international support packages. Where I'm going with this is now enter the World Economic Forum. Oh God, right? Nobody wants to hear this, but this is a great example of how we connect this. So the WEF has stated a while back that pension funds buy government debt. All right? Think about this. Governments also raise money by selling bonds, often to institutional investors or pension funds. It goes on to mention that any investor, if you weren't aware of it, buying a bond is lending the government money for an agreed term, and many bonds pay out interest at regular intervals known as coupon payments. When the agreed term of a bond ends, known as its maturity date, the government pays back the original sum of money. Some bonds are very short term, others last the course for decades. Here's an example. 5% annual coupon. Government kicks that over. And it says, for example, you can get 10,000 pounds back at maturity. This is an example of how a government bond basically works. But what about the United States, for example? Well, Investopedia explains that the United States is usually seen as the lowest risk because it's the world's largest economy and has never defaulted on its sovereign debt. Not yet, but the US dollar is also the world's main reserve currency. We already know that. Excuse me, having a hard time tonight. Currency most likely is to be held by central banks and frequently used for international trade. But that economic muscle means investors can be confident that U.S. Treasury bonds will be honored, allowing the federal government to borrow relatively cheaply. Do you understand when we talk about, guys? Let me come back into the frame for a second. When we talk about Ripple's XRP taking on that debt, well, what about other instruments, right? Other ones. We talked about Stellar when it comes to tokenized bonds, but more importantly, what about Hedera with tokenized bonds? That is where I'm getting at with this. So now I want to take you over to something of this because I think it's crucial. This is straight from Hedera. So how many times do we hear Larry Fink talk about securities and the tokenization of security? Well, look at this. It states, what is a security token offering? STO. A security token is a unique token issued on a permission or permissionless blockchain, representing a stake in an external asset or enterprise. Entities like government and businesses can issue security tokens that serve the same purpose as stocks, bonds, and other equities. Look at this. A security token is not only unique, but basically speaking, what can it be used for? Right? Like use cases. It says company wishing to distribute shares to investors can use a security token that offers the same benefits one would expect from traditional securities like shares, voting rights, and even dividends. Moving forward, since the technology underpins security tokens is blockchain, the advantages are numerous. Well, as we know, Hedera isn't blockchain. It's its own hash graph consensus algorithm. It's its own protocol. Check this out for a second. Finally, to the example of debt. So this is crucial for your understanding. Debt tokens represent a short-term loan on an interest rate. The amount given by investors is a loan to a firm. It could be real estate, mortgages, corporate bonds. Think about that. Or another type of structured debt. A debt's token price is dictated by risk and dividends. This is primarily because of medium risk of default can't be priced the same for a real estate mortgage and a bond for a pre-IPO organization. In terms of blockchain, a smart contract lives on the network, which represents debt security. Within that contract, repayment terms are included. Think about that, guys. Dictating the dividend model and risk factors of the underlying debt. All right, what about asset-backed tokens? Think about this, it's getting better. Such tokens represent ownership of assets such as real estate, art, carbon credits, commodities. Blockchain being secure, immutable, and transparent enables a trusted record of transactions. It reduces the fraud and improves settlement time, thereby becoming a natural fit for the commodities trade. Asset-backed tokens are digital assets with characteristics similar to any commodity such as gold, silver, and oil, which in turn bring value to these traded tokens. Again, bringing value. You guys want to see a flip of a switch? What about having it turbocharged through mandates? All right, here's the icing on the cake, okay? Here it is. Bonds and exchange traded notes. This comes from McKinsey, okay? One of the top ones when it comes to consultant services and so on. So globally, if you weren't aware of it, over 10 billion worth of tokenized bonds in total notional value have been issued in the last decade alone. It goes on to mention That compares with 140 trillion outstanding notionally globally. That's a huge number. Noteworthy. Recent issuers include Siemens, the city of Lugano, and the World Bank, as well as other corporations, government-related entities, and international organizations. Additionally, blockchain-based purchase agreements, which are repos, have found adoption, resulting in trillions of dollars monthly transaction volume in North America and creating value from operational and capital efficiencies and existing flows. See what you want. You could appreciate that Hedera in itself is probably what the greenest of the green when it comes to, like, when we talk about all this utility being used. It's not going to cost a lot in regards to electricity, so the government is really going to appreciate that. Going a little bit more further into it, digital bond issuance will likely continue given the high potential benefits once scaled, as well as comparably to the low barriers today, partially driven by an appetite to spur capital market development in certain regions. For example, and this is a good example, Thailand and the Philippines, the issuance of tokenized bonds enabled inclusion of small ticket investors through fractionalization. While benefits so far have been demonstrated mostly for issuance and end-to-end tokenized bond life cycle, would very well unlock improve operational efficiencies of at least, listen to this guys, 40% through data clarity, automation, embedded compliance, and man, it just goes on and on and on. So, man, I mean, this, in my opinion, was a great finding because it's like tokenized bonds. We could talk about till we're blue in the face, but it's understanding, wow, you just got two great examples. And don't get me wrong, copper is a big deal, but the one that really shined for me basically is the IIF, the Institute of International Finance, jumping into their history and them choosing Hedera. Say what you want. Some people are going to look at the price of Hedera. Again, everybody's putting so much focus on price. You're only investing in short-term plays. For me, it's a long-term investment, and I don't say that disrespectfully speaking. None of this stuff is at mass adoption yet, but it has to be when we get that flip of the switch moment. Mandates, okay? Things going live is one thing. Mandates is another. I'll put my bet on the mandates. I could be wrong. I'm just a person that provides research, but that's where it's at for me. And Hedera's plug to the tokenization of bonds, and more importantly, the connections to the institutions and what we saw in regards to like compounded annual growth rate. Wow, say what you want. Debt has always had a lot of value, and it's who takes on that debt. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you. Smash the like on your way out. Share the program with others. May you all have a blessed rest of your evening. We'll see you on the next one. Some of you guys ask what cold storage solution I use. I use this, and it is the Decent wallet. All right. I also, of course, have a ledger like this. All right. You can get a discount basically from going into the affiliate link, which is in all the live video descriptions and recorded and so on. And for the yahoos that are out there, they're like, this is just a shield. And, you know, Will Fix pointed this out, and it's a great point. Were you aware that you don't necessarily get a discount link just going straight to the site? No, you actually have to go through a platform like this. So how cool is that? You know, I don't think anybody's complaining about that. But anyway, use the link, get a discount. There's another one here. If you're the type of person you want to get one for you and your, you know, significant other, you can get two of them. They actually have another promotion, which is this, and I think this is cool. You can get an all-in-one card wallet plus backup card package. Interesting. I thought that was cool. And again, one of the main key things I like about the Decent wallet is not having to do the red tape of, you know, jumping through all the hoops for XDC and the custom folder. I mean, Edward Vincent can vouch on that. Some of you guys can too as well in regards to Ledger. That was a pain in the butt. You don't have that problem. You literally open up your phone. It's on your app. track everything that's going on, right? And saying goes, not your keys, not your crypto. You know the drill. Check it all out though if you wish to do so. It is truly the cold storage solution that I use for the most part. There's still some on Ledger that I kind of split it up on and so on. So it is what it is. But if I have preference over one, I'm going with this one. A lot easier to use and so on. And some people, even to this day, still ask me which one to use.